Hello everyone. If you're joining me from my debut episode, welcome back. This is Contemporary or Classic. I am your host, Eric Monahan, and in this episode I will be taking a look at two movies. Michael Mann's Manhunter from 1986 and Brett Ratner's Red Dragon from 2002. While the release dates of these movies aren't terribly removed from each other, it is important to establish that the films of the 1980s differ quite a bit from those of the 2000s in terms of filmmaking style, but this is pretty common knowledge even for those who aren't big film buffs or cinephiles, so we will be focusing heavily on this difference later, and I am very excited to do so. Okay, so a little background for the films and the filmmakers. Firstly, Michael Mann's Manhunter was adapted from Thomas Harris's 1981 novel titled Red Dragon. Now, from what I've read, the producer of the film, his name is Dino De Laurentiis, had decided to enforce the name change due to the fact that the original title sounded too similar to that of a kung fu film, which many films of the genre containing the word dragon, I found that to be pretty funny. Now, while I will not be doing a deep dive into the comparisons of the titles, I would absolutely give the edge to Red Dragon right off the bat. It's no contest. Manhunter sounds like a very generic cat and mouse serial killer film title, whereas Red Dragon is a significantly cooler name, and I feel that most would agree. But going back to Manhunter, the film follows an FBI profiler named Will Graham as he comes out of retirement to track down a serial killer who murders entire families during full moons. The film introduced us to our first on-screen appearance of Hannibal Lector, the cannibalizing, serial-killing evil genius. While most people will believe that Hannibal Lecter's first appearance would have been in Jonathan Demme's The Silence of the Lambs, this is not the case. I will also be focusing heavily on this later in the episode. Manhunter certainly takes some liberties and diverts his track from the original source material in a few ways. Other than the lame name change, it has a pretty different ending from the novel, along with various methods of deaths and less in-depth character background exploration. But with that being said, Manhunter still follows the novel pretty closely, but not always. Now, I'll continue with introducing Brett Ratner's Red Dragon. This 2002 remake of Manhunter and the adaptation of the novel of the same name follows the novel much closer than the previous film, including, for example, there are a couple of flashbacks to Graham's past as an FBI profiler capturing Hannibal Lecter, which is completely absent within the 1986 version. But outside of this, there isn't too much to mention that I haven't already touched on, so without further ado, let's figure out which takes the cake, contemporary or classic. Our first comparison is the theme of the film. For starters, Manhunter and Red Dragon both contain similar themes of psychopathy and the fine line between good and evil. In both films, brilliant FBI profiler Will Graham is tasked with tracking down the Tooth Fairy, a serial killer who, during the eve of full moons, enters houses of families and murders them before biting their necks with fang-like imprints. Because of this, Will Graham is asked to come out of retirement and take the case because of his uncanny ability to think like a serial killer. The theme of utilizing this level of intelligence for good and evil is primarily more present within Manhunter, as the entire job and way of thought kind of seems to possess Graham, and it seems to haunt him very much. He knows that while he is just as like-minded and calculated as an average serial killer, the fact that he uses this intelligence for good does not seem to make him feel any better. His rather unpleasant affinity for relating with killers seems to be a gift and a curse for him, illustrating the moral anguish that regularly looms over his life. Even in his lamenting of the Tooth Fairy's violent acts against parents and children alike, his cognitive abilities are just too much for him to not subconsciously haunt himself. Another aspect of the theme is the desire to be normal. For example, the Tooth Fairy, who we will later come to know as Frances Dollarhide, is dating a blind woman named Reba, who cannot see him, literally and metaphorically, as the monster that he is. In this really wonderful sequence within the 1986 version, Francis takes his girlfriend to a veterinarian clinic where a tiger is sedated awaiting surgery for a capped tooth. The vet, who seems to be a friend of Dollarhide, allows them to enter the room where his girlfriend is allowed to touch the tiger.
Yeah. It's warm.
It is during this scene that Francis feels at his most normal, it seems like. He appears to be witnessing his girlfriend embrace a predator with this warmth and love, which is something that she unknowingly does with him on a regular basis that he doesn't really seem to have truly been able to comprehend or appreciate until this point. It's an extremely beautiful scene that I feel should be talked about way more within the film community. Another theme present within the film is obsession. As we go further into the films, we see that Graham has this tendency to kind of obsess over not only the cases and incidents of murder, but also of the men who commit the acts. Going back to the previous point of thinking like a serial killer, Graham does seem to be in this never-ending pursuit for knowledge of how these psychopaths operate, and will go to great lengths to satisfy his thirst for said knowledge. This theme, while heavily present in both films, is portrayed a bit better in the 2002 remake, I would say. The overall depiction of obsession is fleshed out more within the remake, along with a more sympathetic and humanizing accent from actor Edward Norton. Not to say that William Peterson doesn't do a terrific job in Manhunter, but Edward Norton knocks it out of the park as usual with his portrayal of obsessiveness over these human monsters. I'm not saying that Edward Norton hasn't been in bad movies, but I'm not sure if Edward Norton has ever been bad in a movie. So, in terms of overall theme, I'd probably go with Manhunter, but for the obsession aspect, which is a crucial and absolutely necessary part of the story, I would give that to Red Dragon. Again, Edward Norton really sells the entire thing in Red Dragon. Up next, we have characters, and this section will probably be the most in-depth because of my fascination with Brian Cox's portrayal of Hannibal Lecter over Anthony Hopkins. I know that I've literally just detailed the Will Graham character in the previous comparison, so I'll keep my comments relatively light and give the victory to Red Dragon once again. For other characters, I'd like to revisit Hannibal Lecter, as I just mentioned. This may be controversial, but yeah, I prefer Brian Cox's Hannibal Lecter over Anthony Hopkins. Before you guys crucify me, please let me explain. I know that Anthony Hopkins' Hannibal Lecter is an iconic movie villain with endless memorable lines and appearances, but in my opinion, I think he's a little too theatrical with the role. While evil geniuses within films may be prone to displaying this type of behavior, it feels a little too over the top for me sometimes. But I still really do love his performance in the series. I really want to point that out. But as for Brian Cox's Hannibal Lecter, it is absolutely horrifying. Now, some of you may see Manhunter and completely disagree, thinking he's speaking just like any other person would in any idle conversation. But I do disagree. He's so cold and calculated in this role, it is bone-chilling. There's a scene where he's in his cell with very limited access to a telephone, where he manages to find Will Graham's home address and provides it to the Tooth Fairy on the loose with complete ease and calamity. And keep in mind, he is still in prison and is just simply manipulating people behind bars over the phone in order to obtain this information. Extremely creepy in how calmly and smartly he obtains this information. No over-the-top evil faces, no dramatic music, nothing. It's just a brilliant man who uses his psychopathy for pure evil. The next character I want to take a look at is Francis Dollarhide, also known as the Tooth Fairy, who I had mentioned before, played wonderfully by Tom Noonan in the 1986 version.
If you don't open your eyes, I'll staple your eyelids to your forehead. Well, here I am.
In the 2002 version, he's portrayed by Ralph Fiennes, who also played Voldemort in the Harry Potter series. While these are two different takes of the same character in the same universe, they are played out quite differently in a few ways. For example, the 2002 version heavily implies that Dollarhide was severely abused as a child by his grandmother. This is shown through many flashbacks and voiceover narrations by the wonderful Ellen Burstyn, who, in my opinion, is one of the greatest actresses of all time. In the 1986 version, however, there is no mention of his childhood or any mention of a physically, verbally, or even sexually abusive upbringing. While I enjoy the exposition and character development that the 2002 Dollarhide shows us, I will say that I prefer the 1986 Dollarhide backstory more, or I guess lack thereof, as I should say. I feel that the complete lack of cause in his bloodthirsty quest for murdering families makes him all the more horrifying. There is no reason as to why he's doing this. He's just pure evil, and that is all. In the 2002 version, we see that the mental anguish caused by his abuse-ridden childhood has clearly altered his brain in a way that we couldn't possibly comprehend. And while that's still horrifying, I'm still going to side with the 86 version of Dollarhide. The absence of reason is what truly horrifies me here personally. While he has clear motives within the film, I'm purely focusing on his childhood and personal background. Another character who I wanted to talk about is that of Freddie Lowndes, who is a very, very obnoxious journalist and reporter who serves as a semi-antagonist, I should say. In Manhunter, he's played by an actor named Stephen Lang, who was almost unheard of by that point. And he does such a terrific job at being a scared person after being captured by Dollarhide. I had just shown the clip where you see Francis Dollarhide for the first time, and the opening and closing of the clip show a captured Freddie Lowndes being extremely horrified, and the portrayal of genuine fear at seeing someone who is about to kill you is so wonderful in this movie. It looks extremely convincing, in my opinion. Now, this is a really tough one because in the 2002 version of Red Dragon, Freddie Lowndes is played by Philip Seymour Hoffman, who is probably my favorite actor of all time. And not that Stephen Lang isn't wonderful, but it's Philip Seymour Hoffman. He's one of the greatest actors who's ever lived. And as much as it pains me to say this, I do think I prefer Stephen Lang's version because Philip Seymour Hoffman is wonderful as he is in everything. He doesn't seem to give up the bumbling idiot aspect of the character and doesn't convince me in feeling like he's going to die or that these are the last moments of his life, even if he is trying to convince Francis Dollarhide to let him live. I definitely think that Stephen Lang portrays that desperation in a way that Philip Seymour Hoffman somehow just couldn't do, which is a shame. I was really rooting for Philip Seymour Hoffman here, but I'm going to have to give the edge to Stephen Lang for the Manhunter Red Dragon movies. The final section I want to take a look at is the ending of both films. In the 1986 version, there is a sequence of great tension where Francis Dollarhide takes his girlfriend, who by this point is now aware that he is a serial killer, hostage. During a shootout with the police, Francis is shot to death by Will Graham. It's a very standard ending for an 80s action movie, while very stylish in direction and cinematography. But in Red Dragon, Dollarhide fakes his death to lower suspicion from the police, and soon after, as in probably a few days, he breaks into Will Graham's house and holds him hostage. Will manages to mentally break Dollarhide after berating him in the same fashion as his abusive grandmother did as a child. So during a shootout of equal injury, Will's wife of all people actually gets a hold of a gun and kills Dollarhide with multiple gunshots to the head and face. This is pretty much exactly how it plays out in the book, but does have a different ending to the 1986 version. I'm not quite sure why they changed it, other than it probably would have fit a more stereotypical 1980s cop movie ending. Now, while I do prefer the idea of the Red Dragon ending on paper more, I do prefer the ending to the 1986 version in real time. I know it seems like I would prefer a more bonkers ending like the 2002 one offered, but I really do enjoy the simplicity of the gunfight at the end of the original film, and it's shot beautifully. I'm going to give the final product of the ending to Manhunter with the written ending to Red Dragon. Overall, I really do like Red Dragon, but it is Manhunter that I love. The final product is simply a better film, and I highly recommend both movies, but especially Manhunter. With more personally enjoyable stylistic approach and choice, today's winner is Michael Mann's Manhunter, easily. That just about wraps it up for this episode. I'm Eric Monahan, and this has been another episode of Contemporary or Classic.